Hello, and welcome to Street Aesthete. This is the show where we explore street view coverage of a noteworthy location, looking out for beautiful architecture and stunning scenery, while I amuse myself by remarking on what we see, and you rejoin me in the Dutch capital of Amsterdam. This is the third time that we're visiting the city in a row. In the first episode we started at the central station, we walked down the main road to the Koninklijk Palace, and then up this main road here. In the second episode, we started again at the palace and we went up this pedestrian street down the middle here and ended just here. And then, as tempted as we were by the Haarlemmerstraat, I think today we're going to do something a bit different. We're going to have a look at what Amsterdam is actually known for, and that is its beautiful canals. So we'll start just here and we'll walk along the top and then we'll perhaps go down some of them. Already, we've got a Dutch flag, so it's a promising start to the Street Aesthete video. And we can see these hooks hanging off the sides of the buildings so that things can be hoisted up to the upper stories that are too large to be taken up the very narrow and steep staircases that the canal houses are famous for. And Amsterdam is quite a homogeneous city, at least in its historic core that we've been exploring so far. We've got lots of the same sorts of houses, these tall, thin buildings, often with decorative gables on top, and with some kind of dark coloured brick, the predominant building material. But we also see shutters, we see the characteristic forward lean of the facades. This is known as jetting, and we also sometimes see how the relatively unstable ground underneath has subsided so that the buildings are leaning to one side or the other. And something that doesn't really come across, gosh, that's gorgeous. We will have to go down there, I think. Something that doesn't really come across from the street view coverage is the ubiquity of bicycles in the city. Sometimes as a pedestrian walking in Amsterdam, you do have to be really careful that you're not about to step into a cycle path and get in someone's way. The cyclists really rule the roads here, and they tend not to stop for anyone. This chap noticed that he was being captured on Google Street View. Something we can also see that's handy for GeoGuessr players is that most of the cars have these yellow license plates, and they have them on the back, as do British cars, but they also have them on the front. So if you can see a yellow license plate on the front, and you're not sure if it's Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, or Luxembourg, the yellow plates are generally a good tell. And now we get into some beautiful leafy green coverage in the spring. And this is a set of buildings that I was very much hoping we would come across. I think this is one of the iconic views of Amsterdam, this particular set here. Perhaps we can get a better view, in fact, from where we were. Or maybe from down here. Absolutely gorgeous. I love these. They're just so characterful and also varied. In some ways, the buildings in Amsterdam are quite reflective of the Dutch character. Dutch people are some of the tallest in the world on average, and their buildings are tall and thin to reflect that. And the Dutch people also have something of a no-nonsense, straight-to-the-point attitude, and that may be reflected in the way that, for the most part, these facades are unornamented. They're sort of no-nonsense, rectangular, regular sets of windows, but Dutch people do also have a great sense of humour and a sort of whimsical streak in them, and that is reflected by the decorations that we can often see on top of the buildings and their gables. And here we have an absolutely fantastic example of that. Some really intricate Baroque masonry on top of the building here. And Dutch people are also quite ingenious when it comes to making money and innovating. They of course had a large mercantile empire. I mentioned in the previous episode their overseas dominions in Indonesia, South Africa, the Caribbean and South America, but I neglected to mention that they also had a foothold in North America. In fact, one of the most famous cities in the US, New York, was originally founded, indigenous settlement aside, as a Dutch colony. And something about that individualistic, mercantile spirit may be reflected in the variety of buildings. We've got row upon row of these wonderful canal houses, each occupying roughly the same sort of footprint, but each with its very own character, with different coloured brick, different ornamentations on top, different decorations along the side of the edifice, different window elevations and different numbers of stories. It's not at all as though this street was built to a plan. It's as though each house was commissioned and built by a different merchant who had their own specifications about how they wanted it to look. And then something else about the Dutch character is their openness and the way that they seem immune to embarrassment. And that may be reflected in the way that, at least on these canal houses, many of the windows in the buildings are large and without curtains, so that you can see in from the street to what people are getting on with in their private spaces. In fact, the boundary between public and private is somewhat blurred. And that's very different to the British character, with which I'm much more familiar. We are much more private people. We like to keep ourselves to ourselves. Our business is nobody else's business. And it really is a delight to see all of the buildings alongside the canal here. Now I think we may be quite near, yes, Anne Frank's house is just going to be coming up on our left, I believe. And we can start to see the queue to get in. Although I have visited Amsterdam, I didn't go into the museum. And I'm not sure exactly which house it is, or if indeed... See, this looks as though it's a newer construction. Perhaps they converted what was the canal house, or maybe it was an addition. But I have read Anne Frank's diary. I sometimes find it difficult to believe just how recent all of that history is. It's within living memory that Amsterdam was occupied by the Germans. Let's head across and go to the next canal, shall we? Also, I can't let this go by without remark. Just incredible, it's so tall and imposing. A very grand edifice. But there is something rather austere about it, and that perhaps is a reflection of the Protestant faith prevalent in the Netherlands. Certainly we have these classical columns. It's not as though we're without decoration on this building, but it's also not lavish with sculptures, carvings, gargoyles, or the Gothic spires that we might expect to see in Germany and France, let alone the Baroque and Renaissance ornamentation of Spanish or Italian churches. Most of what we're presented with is brick, very much a reflection in architecture of the Reformation. This facade here particularly caught my eye. I like the way that it's bristling with these little spires. Really wonderful. And a very pleasing orangey red colour of brick as well. Here is actually perhaps a better example of what I was talking about earlier with these very large windows open to the street. I remember when walking along these canals in person, finding it almost impossible not to accidentally peer into people's private living rooms. But I don't think that the people in them would have been particularly abashed had they noticed that I was looking. A lovely trio of step gables here. Part of the reason that the canal houses ended up the way they are, tightly packed and tall and thin, was that space alongside a canal was really at a premium. All of the merchants moving into the city wanted to have immediate access to the water so that they could move their wares through the canals and then on to the port to participate in trade. And so these plots next to the canal were some of the most sought after. In the 16th century, most of the lowland countries were under Spanish rule, and it was after the sack of Antwerp, which previously had been the principal city of the area, and indeed very much a trading hub, that Amsterdam started to come into its own and became the new trading hub of the Low Countries. And I'll just pause in my potted history to admire the sun hitting these buildings. Absolutely gorgeous. Much of the Netherlands is very low-lying and a lot of it very boggy, not the ideal land for agriculture. And so a lot of the wheat and grain had to be imported from elsewhere. And so Amsterdam's access to the North Sea was a real benefit to it. It made a lot of its money as a transfer port for goods coming in from the Baltic Sea further to the east. It really is a delightful place. Often known as the Venice of the North, and with all its waterways we can perhaps see why. Although of course quite a few other cities have been known as the Venice of the North. Think of St. Petersburg in Russia, and indeed even Birmingham in England, which certainly lacks the beauty of Venice or even of Amsterdam, but it does have a greater length of canals than even Venice. This is rather unfortunate, it has to be said. Now, not all of the buildings that we've seen alongside the canals have been historic and beautiful, but the vast majority of them have been, and those that weren't were very much in keeping in their aesthetic design with what had come before. This, on the other hand, is a travesty. I mean, I really can't insult it enough. The colours are bland and terrible. They, rather than catching the eye and drawing you in with reddish browns and white highlights which just catch the eye and make you want to look closer, this practically repels your vision. Straight parallel lines, unbroken, boring uniformity here, no ornamentation, no decoration, trash. The only thing that this has going for it is the trees alongside it. The world does not need this. The world needs more unique and characterful and beautiful buildings like these. And look, these aren't even necessarily all that beautiful. In many ways, they're sort of simple and practical. And taken in isolation, this even might be considered ugly, but it's the variety of facades with a similar plan and configuration but slightly differing that really has a beautiful effect when viewed as a whole. This, on the other hand, has no variation whatsoever. Certainly some bits stick out, some bits are recessed, but it's all the same colour, all the same window configuration throughout. And as I've been describing, the canal houses were the product of a particular history and a particular set of circumstances that are no longer operant in the modern world. All the reasons that there were to build in this way are no longer relevant. And yes, it may be disingenuous to try to build like this again, but that doesn't mean that we can't apply the aesthetic principles extrapolated from these buildings to modern building techniques. There's a design language here, and those modern grey buildings further down don't speak that same language. They are an alien imposition. They ruin the cohesion of the street, and they make a mockery of its past. And with that, I'm going to be leaving Amsterdam for now. As you can probably tell, I could explore the place for hours and hours, but one of the words that has come up again and again in our 3 explorations of Amsterdam is variety, and I want to apply that same principle of variety to my channel as well. So next time we'll be exploring somewhere different. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Since you've made it this far, why not subscribe to make sure you don't miss what comes next? If you've enjoyed the music that you hear in this video, then please do take a look at my first channel, which is where I upload all of my original music.